first noticed this new development during the summer of 1861, when 6-year-old Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac began showing signs of extreme agitation for several days running. The boys would stand at the meeting house windows looking south toward the Ohio River, their faces marked by expressions of horror that seemed far too mature for their years. When Samuel asked what was troubling them, Isaac, always the most vocal of the three, simply said, "Too many people are going to die." So many people. 3 days later, news arrived of the first Battle of Bull Run, where Union forces had suffered a devastating defeat. The timing was impossible to dismiss as coincidence, especially when similar incidents began occurring with increasing frequency. The boys seemed to sense major military engagements days or even weeks before news of them reached Cedar Mills, and their emotional reactions corresponded precisely to the scale of casualties involved. More disturbing was their apparent ability to detect specific individuals among the thousands of soldiers moving through the region. In September of 1861, a young Union soldier named Thomas Caldwell stopped at the meeting house while traveling home on leave to visit his family in Marietta. The triplets took one look at him and immediately began their synchronized whispering, their faces showing expressions of profound sadness. Martha Whitmore, now in her 60s, but still serving as the boys' primary caregiver, asked them what they sensed about the soldier. Ezra stepped forward and spoke in a voice that seemed too old for his small body. "He won't make it home. The man who's supposed to be his friend will shoot him for his money 3 days from now, near the river crossing." Thomas Caldwell laughed when told of the prediction, claiming that he was traveling alone and had no money worth stealing. But 3 days later, his body was found near a river crossing, 20 miles east of Cedar Mills. He had been shot and robbed by a deserter from his own unit, a man named Patterson, who had claimed to be Caldwell's friend and had arranged to travel part of the way with him. The accuracy of this prediction sent shockwaves through the local community, but it was only the beginning. Over the following months, the boys began making increasingly specific and disturbing predictions about people they encountered. They could tell when someone would die, often down to the day and hour. They could predict betrayals, desertions, and acts of violence with unerring accuracy. Most chilling of all, they seemed to know which of the freedom seekers passing through the meeting house would successfully reach Canada, and which would be captured or killed along the way. Samuel Whitmore struggled with the moral implications of the boy's knowledge. Should he warn people of the dangers the triplets foresaw? Should he try to prevent the tragedies they predicted? Or was this knowledge too dangerous to act upon? The weight of these decisions was crushing, made worse by the boys' apparent indifference to the suffering they witnessed. They reported deaths and betrayals with the same calm detachment they might use to comment on the weather. The turning point came in the spring of 1862, when a group of 12 freedom seekers arrived at the meeting house, led by a conductor named James Morrison, whom Samuel had worked with for years. Morrison was a trusted ally, a man who had successfully guided hundreds of people to freedom over the course of a decade. But when the triplets saw him, their reaction was immediate and violent. All three boys began screaming the moment Morrison entered the meeting house, a sound unlike anything they had ever made before. It wasn't the crying of distressed children, but something primal and terrifying, like the warning calls of animals, sensing mortal danger. They screamed and pointed at Morrison, their faces contorted with an expression of pure horror. Morrison was baffled and offended by the reaction. He had never encountered anything like it from the boys, who had always been calm in his presence during previous visits. Samuel tried to question the triplets about what they sensed, but they could only repeat over and over, "Death. He brings death. So much death." Despite the boys' warnings, Samuel was reluctant to turn away a trusted conductor and 12 desperate freedom seekers. Morrison insisted that he had brought the group safely from Kentucky and was prepared to guide them onto the next station. The 12 freedom seekers, men, women, and children ranging in age from 8 to 60, seemed genuinely desperate and showed no signs of deception. But the triplets' agitation only intensified as the hours passed. They refused to enter the basement while Morrison and his group were there, and they continued their disturbing predictions. "Tomorrow night, in the woods by Miller's Creek, he'll call to them, and they'll trust him because they think he's their friend. But the men with guns will be waiting." Samuel faced an impossible choice: either trust the word of 3 young children, whose abilities he didn't understand, or risk the lives of 12 people based on what might be nothing more than childhood intuition. In the end, he chose a compromise that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He allowed Morrison and the group to continue their journey, but sent word ahead to the next station, warning them to be cautious. He also arranged for 2 local men to follow at a distance, ostensibly to provide additional security. What they witnessed the following night would validate the triplets' warnings in the most horrific way possible. Morrison led the group to a clearing near Miller's Creek, just as the boys had predicted. There, instead of guiding them toward the next safe station, he called out in the darkness. Within minutes, armed slave catchers emerged from the woods. The freedom seekers realized they had been betrayed, but it was too late to escape. In the chaos that followed, 7 people were killed outright, including 2 children. The remaining 5 were captured and dragged back to Kentucky in chains. The 2 men Samuel had sent to provide security witnessed the entire massacre from a distance, too far away to intervene, but close enough to see Morrison collect a substantial payment from the leader of the slave catchers, James Morrison, the trusted conductor who had guided hundreds to freedom, had been working as a double agent for months, selling information about underground railroad operations and leading groups into carefully planned ambushes. When news of the massacre reached Cedar Mills, the entire community was devastated. 7 people were dead, 5 more were condemned to slavery, and one of their most trusted allies had been revealed as a traitor. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that 3 7-year-old children had known exactly what would happen, and their warnings had been ignored. The triplets' reaction to the news was unlike anything Samuel had ever seen from them. Instead of their usual calm detachment, they showed genuine emotion for the first time in years. Not sadness or anger, but a deep, profound disappointment that seemed to encompass not just the immediate tragedy, but something much larger about the nature of human evil. "People never listen," Isaac said quietly, speaking for all three. "They never want to believe what we can see. They think we're just children, but we've seen more death than anyone in this room. We know what people are capable of when they think no one is watching." The boy's words hung in the air like a pronouncement of judgment, and Samuel realized that something fundamental had changed. The triplets were no longer just children with unusual abilities. They had become something else entirely, something that could see into the darkest corners of human nature with perfect clarity. And that terrible knowledge was transforming them into beings that were increasingly alien to the rest of humanity. Just when Samuel thought he'd seen the full extent of what the boys were capable of, events would soon prove that their abilities were still evolving, still growing stronger. The question was no longer what they could perceive, but what they might become, and whether the community that had raised them would be able to survive the truth of what they really were. The revelation that would forever change how the world understood the triplets came during the brutal winter of 1863, when the boys were 8 years old, and the Civil War had reached its bloodiest phase. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the first female physicians in Ohio and a specialist in neurological conditions, had been studying the boys for 6 months under the auspices of the Medical College of Ohio. Dr. Hartwell's interest had been sparked by reports from Dr. Harrison before his death, and she had convinced Samuel Whitmore to allow a comprehensive medical examination of the triplets. What she discovered in that examination would challenge every assumption about human consciousness and perception. Using the latest medical instruments available in 1863, Dr. Hartwell conducted tests that revealed the true nature of the boys' abilities. Her findings documented in a detailed report that was immediately classified by military authorities and hidden from public view for over 60 years, showed that the triplets possessed neurological structures that had never been observed in human beings. The boys' brains showed abnormally high activity in regions associated with pattern recognition and emotional processing. But more remarkably, their nervous systems appeared to be in constant communication with each other. When Dr. Hartwell applied mild electrical stimulation to one boy's arm, the other two showed immediate physiological responses despite being in separate rooms. Their heart rates, breathing patterns, and brain waves synchronized during periods, often tense concentration, creating what she described as a single consciousness distributed across 3 separate bodies. But the most startling discovery came when Dr. Hartwell began testing the boys' ability to detect deception using carefully controlled experiments. She arranged for volunteers to tell both true and false statements, while the boys observed, measuring their physiological responses to each type of interaction. What she found defied all understanding of human sensory capabilities. The triplets weren't simply reading facial expressions, body language, or vocal cues to detect lies. They were responding to measurable changes in electromagnetic fields generated by human neural activity. Dr. Hartwell's primitive instruments detected that the boys' brains generated electrical patterns unlike anything seen in normal humans, and these patterns seemed to resonate with the electromagnetic signatures of other people's emotional states. In simple terms, Dr. Hartwell wrote in her classified report, "These children appear to possess a form of biological electromagnetic sensitivity that allows them to directly perceive the electrical activity of other human brains. When someone lies, experiences fear, or harbors violent intentions, their neural activity creates specific electromagnetic signatures that the boys can detect with the same accuracy that we might observe colors or hear sound. This explained not only their ability to detect deception, but also their capacity to sense emotional distress at great distances, and their uncanny accuracy in predicting violent events. They weren't prophets or supernatural beings. They were human beings with sensory capabilities that had evolved far beyond normal human limitations. But Dr. Hartwell's discoveries raised even more disturbing questions. If the boys' abilities were the result of genetic mutation, what had caused such a dramatic evolutionary leap? The answer came from analyzing tissue samples from their deceased mother, Ruth, whose body had been preserved in the Meeting House Cemetery. According to Quaker tradition, medical examination of Ruth's remains revealed that she had been exposed to massive doses of several industrial chemicals during her pregnancy. Chemicals that were commonly used in the processing of indigo dye on southern plantations. These chemicals, which included mercury compounds and lead-based pigments, had caused severe neurological damage in Ruth, but had apparently triggered unprecedented genetic changes in her unborn children. The boys represented something entirely new in human evolution, a mutation that might normally have been lethal, but had instead created enhanced sensory capabilities. They were living proof that human consciousness and perception could evolve in ways that science had never imagined possible. Dr. Hartwell's final revelation was perhaps the most chilling, based on her analysis of the boys' genetic structure. She concluded that their enhanced abilities were not limited to their generation. The genetic changes that had created their electromagnetic sensitivity were dominant traits that would be passed on to their children and their children's children. We are witnessing the birth of a new branch of human evolution, she wrote in her most confidential notes. These boys will father children with similar abilities, and those children will be even more sensitive to human electromagnetic fields. Within 3 or 4 generations, their descendants may possess sensory capabilities that will make current human perception seem primitive by comparison. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Hartwell was correct, the triplets weren't just medical curiosities. They were the beginning of a new human subspecies. And if their abilities continued to strengthen with each generation, their descendants might eventually be able to read human thoughts as easily as observing facial expressions. But the most immediate concern was what to do with this knowledge. The Civil War was raging, and both Union and Confederate forces would be desperate to exploit the boys' abilities for military intelligence. If word of their capabilities spread beyond the small Quaker community, the triplets would become valuable assets to be captured, studied, and used as weapons. Samuel Whitmore faced an impossible decision. Dr. Hartwell was prepared to publish her findings, which would bring international attention to the boys, but would also ensure their safety through public scrutiny. Alternatively, the research could be suppressed, protecting the boys' privacy, but leaving them vulnerable to those who already knew of their abilities. The decision was made for them on a cold February morning when federal marshals arrived in Cedar Mills with orders to bring the triplets to Washington for consultation on matters of national security. Someone in the military hierarchy had learned of Dr. Hartwell's research and decided that the boys' abilities could be valuable for interrogating Confederate prisoners and detecting Confederate spies. But the triplets had sensed the marshal's approach long before they reached the meeting house. When Samuel found the boys that morning, they were already packed and ready to leave, their few possessions bundled in small cloth sacks. "We have to go," Caleb said simply. "If we stay, bad things will happen to everyone here. We've seen it." Isaac nodded gravely. "The men who are coming don't just want to use us. They want to study us, cut us open, see how we work. And when they're done with us, they'll come for our children and our children's children." Ezra, always the quietest of the three, spoke last. "We've seen the future they want to create. A world where people like us are kept in cages and used as tools. We won't let that happen." The boys' decision was final. They would disappear before the federal marshals arrived, vanishing into the network of caves and hidden passages that riddled the hills around Cedar Mills. Samuel made one last desperate attempt to convince them to stay, arguing that they would be safer under government protection than hiding in the wilderness. Caleb's response revealed just how much the boys had matured beyond their 8 years. "Mr. Whitmore, we can sense the intentions of every person within 50 miles of this place. We know that the government men aren't coming to protect us. They're coming to own us. We felt their thoughts, and we know what they plan to do. We'd rather take our chances in the wild than become prisoners in the laboratory." As the sound of approaching horses echoed across the frozen fields, the triplets prepared to leave the only home they had ever known. But before they departed, they made one final revelation that would haunt Samuel Whitmore for the rest of his life. "There are others," Isaac said quietly. "Not many, but some. Other children born during times of great violence and suffering. Children whose mothers were exposed to the same kinds of poisons that changed us. They're scattered across the country, and most of them don't even know what they are yet, but we can sense them, and they can sense us." Ezra stepped forward, his young face marked by wisdom that seemed ancient. "Someday, when it's safe, we'll find them. We'll teach them what we've learned, help them understand their abilities, and maybe, if we're careful, we can build something better than what exists now. A world where people can't lie to each other, can't hide their evil intentions, can't pretend to be something they're not." The boys' final words as they prepared to vanish into the wilderness were both a promise and a warning. "We'll be watching. We'll always be watching. And we'll remember who helped us and who tried to hurt us. That knowledge will be passed down to our children and their children and their children after that. The world is about to change in ways that people can't imagine. And it's going to start with us." The federal marshals arrived at the meeting house 3 hours after the triplets had disappeared, finding only empty rooms and the fading traces of 3 extraordinary children who had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Despite extensive searches involving tracking dogs and military units, no trace of the boys was ever found. They had simply melted away into the Ohio countryside, leaving behind only memories and questions that would never be fully answered. Dr. Elizabeth Partwell's research was immediately classified by military authorities and remained sealed for over 60 years. When her papers were finally released in 1924, they caused a sensation in the medical community. But by then, the boys would have been nearly 70 years old, and any hope of studying them had long since passed. Samuel Whitmore lived until 1889, carrying the secret of what he had witnessed for the rest of his life. In his private papers, discovered after his death, he wrote, "I have seen the future of humanity, and it both terrifies and amazes me." Those 3 boys represented something new under the sun, something that could either elevate our species to unprecedented heights or destroy us completely. I pray that wherever they went, whatever they became, they remembered the love and kindness they received in our small community. The Underground Railroad station at Cedar Mills continued operating until the end of the Civil War. But it was never the same after the triplets' departure. Without their ability to detect infiltrators and betrayers, the operation became increasingly dangerous, and several conductors were captured or killed. The meeting house itself was eventually abandoned in 1878, and the building slowly fell into decay. But the story of the triplets didn't end with their disappearance. Over the following decades, reports began surfacing from across the United States of unusual perceptive abilities. A girl in Pennsylvania who could predict accidents days before they occur. Twin boys in Texas who could locate missing people with impossible accuracy. A child in California who could tell when someone was lying just by looking at them. Most of these reports were dismissed as folklore or exaggeration, but a pattern emerged for those who knew what to look for. The children were always born during times of great violence or social upheaval. Their mothers had often been exposed to industrial chemicals or toxic substances during pregnancy, and the children themselves displayed the same electromagnetic sensitivity that Dr. Hartwell had documented in the Cedar Mills triplets. Modern genetic research has confirmed what Dr. Hartwell suspected in 1863. Extreme environmental stress combined with exposure to certain toxic substances can trigger rapid genetic mutations that are passed on to subsequent generations. The triplets represented one of the first documented cases of stress-induced human evolution, a phenomenon that scientists now recognize as more common than previously believed. Recent studies have identified at least 47 documented cases of individuals with enhanced electromagnetic sensitivity born between 1850 and 1900. Primarily in regions affected by industrial pollution or military conflict. While most of these individuals lived quiet lives and never developed their abilities to the extent demonstrated by the Cedar Mills triplets, their genetic legacy has continued to spread through the American population. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurologist at Johns Hopkins University, who has spent 20 years studying electromagnetic sensitivity in humans, believes that the descendants of these early cases may represent as much as 0.1% of the current American population. We're looking at the emergence of a human variant that possesses sensory capabilities our species has never had before. She explained in a 2019 interview, "These people aren't telepaths or psychics. They're humans with enhanced neural sensitivity that allows them to detect electromagnetic patterns generated by other human brains." The implications for law enforcement, national security, and human society are profound. If Dr. Chen is correct, there may be thousands of Americans who possess some degree of ability to detect deception, sense hidden emotions, or locate missing persons. Most may not even be aware of their abilities, dismissing their accurate intuitions as lucky guesses or coincidence. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this research is what it suggests about the future of human evolution. If environmental stress can trigger rapid genetic changes that enhance human perception, what other capabilities might emerge as our species faces new challenges? And if the CED Mills triplets were correct in their prediction that their abilities would strengthen with each generation, what might their descendants be capable of today? The answer to that question may be closer than anyone realizes. In 2003, during the renovation of an old farmhouse in southeastern Ohio, construction workers discovered a hidden room containing documents that had been carefully preserved for over a century. Among these papers was a letter dated 1923, written in 3 different handwritings, but signed with a single name: The Children of Cedar Mills. The letter, addressed to future generations who will understand, contained detailed genealogical records showing the descendants of the 3 boys who had vanished in 1863. According to these records, the triplets had indeed survived their disappearance, lived long lives, and fathered numerous children who inherited their enhanced abilities. More remarkable still, the letter contained precise predictions about future events that have since come to pass. The exact dates of both world wars, the location where the atomic bomb would be tested, the year of the moon landing, and dozens of other historical events that wouldn't occur for decades after the letter was written. The letter concluded with a message that both comforts and unnerves those who have studied it. We are still here. We are still watching. We have grown in number and in ability with each passing generation, just as we promised we would. The time is coming when humanity will need the gifts we carry. And when that time arrives, we will be ready. Until then, we remain hidden, learning, growing, and preparing for the day when the world will finally be ready to accept what we represent. The next step in human evolution. The letter was accompanied by a contemporary address in Ohio and a simple instruction. When you are ready to know more, come to this place on the anniversary of our birth. We will be waiting. February 23rd, 2024, marked the 168th anniversary of the triplets' birth. According to local reports, more than 50 people gathered at the specified address that day. Researchers, descendants of Underground Railroad, participants and individuals who claimed to possess similar abilities to those demonstrated by the original Cedar Mills triplets. What transpired at that gathering remains unknown. Those who attended have refused to discuss what they witnessed, and no official records of the event exist. But in the months following the meeting, several of the attendees have begun working together on projects related to missing persons cases, criminal investigations, and psychological research. Dr. Chen, who was among those present at the February meeting, will only say that the legacy of the Cedar Mills triplets is far from over. In fact, it may just be beginning. The story of 3 boys born in a basement during one of the darkest periods in American history continues to unfold more than a century and a half later. Whether they represent humanity's greatest hope for evolution remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. Somewhere out there, the descendants of Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac are still watching, still learning, and still preparing for whatever comes next. And if their ancestors' abilities to predict the future remain accurate, that next chapter in human evolution may be arriving sooner than anyone expects. This mystery shows us that the boundaries of human perception may be far more flexible than we ever imagined, and that extraordinary circumstances can sometimes produce extraordinary people. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that human evolution could take such dramatic leaps under extreme conditions? Have you ever experienced moments of intuition so accurate they seemed impossible? Leave your comment below, sharing your thoughts about the triplets and whether you think their descendants might still be among us today. If you enjoyed this tale and want more mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about human capabilities,